Greetings to everyone. This is the African Esquire show on WCC TV, and I am your host, Tierney Cherie. I want to talk about something that I saw trending on social media yesterday, and it's not the first time that I've seen this trending. I'm sure you may have seen it trending a number of times by now, and that was Africans versus African Americans. Now, I'm going to talk about it in light of an article that I just wrote for WCC. If you go to wechargecolonialism.org, if you go to articles, you will see an article that I wrote called Data Colonies. Data colonies, and explaining how our futures have been planned to live inside of a digital age, and how this new future is going to be very controlled, very monitored, and easy for our oppressors to distort and to distract us. And this is essentially the issue I want to talk about with things like this when they trend on social media. Africans versus African Americans was trending. My understanding is that, and I didn't go into following every single tweet, but my understanding is that there was a conversation where essentially someone may have conveyed something that was something of the line of Africans coming to America who get jobs basically are adversaries to quote unquote African Americans. I don't use the word African Americans in my as my personal identity, and the reason why is, I'll play this video right here if you don't know.
There's no such thing as African American. The only thing American about Africans is exploitation and slavery. The only thing American about Africans is disenfranchisement and racism. The only thing American about Africans is being used as cannon fodder in the British war. We are Africans. We understand that our nation is Africa. We understand that we were stolen from Africa. And we understand that we are stolen property in Africa. So in no way do we who are stolen try to become part of the kidnapping nation.
I associate our stint in the United States of America as an unpleasant time, a time that began in slavery, a time that did not begin in joy and happiness, and everything connected to the American part of our African existence has always been in misery, has always been in torment, has always been in suffering. And any type of bright spot that we're told to celebrate has only been a bright spot inside of a whole pool of despair. And so it's really not bright if you think about it like that. But if you want to use that label, that's your business. But anyways, the point is that if you are someone who is descended from the transatlantic slave trade, particularly American chattel slavery, you're descended from those Africans who were enslaved, you might call yourself an African American. I am also descended from those Africans who were enslaved through American chattel slavery. Now, my understanding is that the conversation was something of the nature of African Americans versus Africans, Africans coming to US, make it harder for African Americans to basically be able to survive because we're all living inside of this white supremacist country trying to get these scraps, right? That's really what we're kind of saying. Like, we don't control the politics, we don't control the social institutions, we don't control the economic institutions. So rather than try to get power amongst ourselves, we have to basically resort to bad mouthing each other because one person might have an advantage that the other people do not have. Whether that's true or not, that's essentially what the conversation was. I'm not going to get into the truth or the falsity of that. Everything that we argue about, usually there's some truth to it, and there's also usually some type of falsity to it. So it's important for us to always have that in mind. Stereotypes are stereotypes for reasons. You're going to find someone who's going to fulfill that stereotype. If your stereotype is of Africans, that Africans come to the US, they hate African Americans, and they don't have respect for us, I promise you will find Africans who are just that. And vice versa. If you're someone who's African from the continent, your stereotype of African Americans is that African Americans are loud, ghetto, and whatever type of stereotype you've been taught. You're going to find people who exude just that, because stereotypes are stereotypes for reasons. There are people who exist that fulfill those stereotypes. The question is, are those people the rule? Are they the exception? Or are they an anomaly? Those are the things that you have to question the more that you actually encounter one another. And you won't be able to figure that out on social media, unfortunately. But beside that debate, let's talk about the fact that we're so comfortable having these conversations on social media. At one time in our history, whenever there would be conversations about, let's say, internal, like regardless of if you are from African from the continent, African in the United States, identify yourself African American, ADOS, FBA, whatever you identify yourself as. At one time in our history, we would probably have these types of conversations inside of a different forum than on Twitter. One of the forums that you might see these conversations happening is at a closed door lecture or at a community center. If you look back in the old days, even whenever these conversations did spill over into TV, it was usually on Black channels where the overall viewership would be Black people. But today, instead, we've gotten comfortable with the fact that our conversations are open for all to see. And this is the exact issue that I talk about inside of this article, Data Colonies. So again, to reference the article, there's a real issue if you understand who controls Twitter. The person who controls Twitter is also the person who controls everything, or not the person, the entities that control everything, from YouTube to more and more Facebook and Instagram. These are all entities that are very closely linked to an agency known as the Central Intelligence Agency. Don't believe me? Do your research. Look up how Google came to be. The way that Google actually came to be is that the Central Intelligence Agency wanted a way to mass monitor people like you and I and be able to know what we were doing, where we were going, what we were talking about, have a way to track us. So they basically put out these grants and funded the creation of this thing that we now call Google. And if you think about it, every single person probably has to rely on Google in some way by way of their smartphone use. So if you use Google Maps, if you use Google Docs, if you use YouTube, if you use any of these social media avenues, then you're probably logging into Google, right? But if you understand that Google is controlled by, again, the Central Intelligence Agency, are you really logging into some type of unbiased network? Or are you literally logging into the CIA? If you told yourself that you're logging into the CIA to have this conversation, then would you do things differently? Twitter is also very much tied and controlled by Google. The Twitter cloud is actually backed up by the Google cloud. So all of these conversations you're having, and I'm not just talking about this conversation, I'm seeing our people more and more go towards using Twitter, the Twitter groups and whatever. These conversations are being uploaded to the Google Cloud, which is controlled by the CIA. Now, I'm saying that to draw a parallel for us. We've created this thing in our mind called Black Twitter without questioning the veracity of if there's really that strong of a block of people on Twitter to have certain things trend whenever it pertains to us. Now, that's a possibility. Maybe there's really that many people on Twitter who's of African descent constantly tweeting. I personally don't know that many in my personal life, but maybe there is a lot. But maybe there's another alternative. Maybe we're really not on Twitter all like that. Maybe Black Twitter is actually something that's a creation. Whenever we have serious issues going on in our communities, we're actually willing to talk about things like coming together, talk about unity. What if this whole idea of Black Twitter, where we see things trending pertaining to us, was really a way to drive our conversation away from radical ideas, away from more powerful or power grabbing ideas, and to drive us instead towards talking about things like celebrity gossip or having conversations like this, Africans versus African Americans. So if you're on the continental African side of that, or if you're on the African American side of that debate, ask yourself, at what point in this conversation that you engaged in did you steer any of your energy towards your oppressor? Because you should know, regardless, African American, neither of which are your oppressors. Your oppressors are the ones who are controlling your communities. Your oppressors are the ones that are incarcerating you. Your oppressors are the ones who have your resources. Your oppressors are the ones, many times, for many of our continental brothers and sisters who have immigrated, they're the reason why we had to immigrate, because there are resources in our continent and in our homeland, Africa, is constantly under control by people who do not look like us. So if you think about the fact that certain things will trend on Twitter that have a direct possibility of distracting us from actually putting our attention on who actually is our oppressor, and instead of fighting a common enemy, you're fighting each other, then you have to draw more parallels. Twitter, again, Twitter controlled by the Central Intelligence Agency. The Central Intelligence Agency, which controls Google, and Twitter and Google are now like this, right? As well as all of the other other major social media platforms. Can it be so coincidental that we spend so much time spreading venom, sharing things that have no causal reality to what we're facing today, talking about things that will absolutely not challenge the power of our oppressor? Could it be that the fact that we see these things trending and we jump into these conversations are a direct cause of a social experiment to see how much we can stay controlled while our conditions are worsening? Inflation's getting worse across the world. How much of that conversation was about the fact that our destinies are being controlled by people who do not look like us? The fact that we're being killed by people who do not look like us? The fact that we are being killed by people who look like us, that are being who are being sponsored by the white supremacist state? How much of that conversation goes towards that? This is important for us to understand as we move more into this digital age, because I promise you, these types of trending events inside of these Twitter conversations that we're having on the Central Intelligence Agency's cloud, they're going to become more and more common. And I'm not saying this to say that I have any illusion that most people are going to hear this and say, okay, you're right, Tierney, let me not engage in these conversations. Let me pull away. I actually don't think that that's the case. I think there's enough people, though, who will hear me and understand that we have to have an alternative means of communicating with one another. If you have significant issues with continental Africans from the Caribbean, Africans from the Americas, wherever, if you have significant issues, there are proper venues to have those conversations. Have it at a black university. Have it at a community group. Have it at somewhere that is outside of the gaze of your oppressors. Have it somewhere where you can actually talk about solutions and not talk about your feelings and not be into trying to demonize the other side. Have it in a place where it's actually going to lead to someone walking away with more power out of the situation. We do know by now that if we're united, that we are stronger, but divided, we will always be weaker. We should know this just by reading history and understanding history. We know that divide and conquer is a direct tactic from our oppressor. So at some point, we have to say, listen, these issues that we're talking about and that we're having these conversations with, are they going to lead to a better future for us in common, or are they only going to further the divide and therefore consolidate power for the people who are oppressing us equally? That's the question that you should be. We're going to go right now to the article, Data Colonies, and I hope that I can hopefully draw some parallels to you as far as what we're doing inside of these spaces that could be a risk to our people, to our furtherance of our liberation struggle, and how we can maybe draw back and try to figure out alternative ways that we can figure out solutions to our problems that are not on an open internet where anyone can come in and monitor, come in and derail the conversation. We don't even know if the people who we're having these conversations with or what they say they are. They could be some white person out inside of Alaska acting like they're African or African American. They could be doing these types of things, and we don't know because this is not controlled by us. So again, the article is called Data Colonies, the planned future for the oppressed in the future globalist system. I'm not going to read through all of it. I'm going to leave the description inside. I'm going to leave the link to the link to the article inside of the description so you can see it yourself. But I want to talk to some parts that I feel like do relate directly to this whole issue of us feeling comfortable with things like Twitter. Now, I talk about the protests that happened last year inside of Nigeria. If you don't remember, SARS was a major protest against police brutality, SARS being the Nigerian police force that was doing these horrible acts of brutality. Now, this was an underground movement that started with a number of organizations, but Guess who jumps into the fight to save the poor Africans? It was Twitter. Twitter, at the time ran by Jack Dorsey, decided to endorse certain groups inside of this on-the-ground movement. The groups who they decided to endorse were ones that were, in my opinion, more focused towards issues that are more palpable to the global international human rights community. Those that do not go directly towards the colonial system, that may be admirable in some respects, but not inside of the power shifting respects. Those are the issues that were focused on. So, for example, this is an issue of police brutality. It was facing Nigerians across the board. Yeah, one group that was funded, received a lot of funds, was one that was more focused on women's issues. Well, women's issues are serious, absolutely. But we're talking right now about power. We're talking about power for women, men, and children. So why are you funding one group that does not have the history or does not have the on the ground presence that is more focused on an issue that is more acceptable to the international community, but you're not funding the groups that do have issues that are direct to our position as African people, that we need to be free from the colonial system? Well, this is obviously what they do to us. So as I said in the article, we saw the Great White Solution play out in last year's NSARS protests, when Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari banned the social media giant Twitter in response to an apparent regime change attempt by Twitter to fund civil society opposition groups on the ground using Bitcoin. Many so-called human rights activists who had been all but silent about the Nigerian government's countless collusions with globalists that severely deprive Nigerians of their basic needs suddenly felt the need to speak up, because God forbid their access to Twitter be interrupted. That's right. A lot of people decided that they wanted to speak up for Nigerians, not because of the fact that Nigeria is being controlled by the West, not because of the fact that Nigerians are suffering because of this colonial globalism that has been pitched to them as something that's going to bring prosperity to them. Not because of that, but because they lost access to Twitter when Muhammadu Buhari banned access to Twitter. See how sneaky they are with finding things that they can get some people rallied up about. Meanwhile, their overall conditions are ignored, and certainly the people who cause the conditions are again ignored. Going back to the article, it says we should understand by now that imperialists provide no resource to Africans without expecting a quadruple return. Whoever you are, understand this. Nothing that we receive, free access to Facebook, free access to Twitter, free access to Instagram, none of these things are going to be given to a people who are not seeing the long-term return, whether it is them selling you things or whether it is them being able to monitor and track you. They have ways to make sure that the small concession that they have to make to let this be available to everyone is going to enrich them greatly in the end. However, we are all told to dutifully trust the goodwill of the global system, that their desire to provide internet access is unpretentious and pure, but the agenda is not hard to uncover. The World Economic Forum's proclamation in the Great Reset said, "You will own nothing and be happy." I did a whole video on this. You could check that out. Has to sound an alarm in the mind of the oppressed African. They clearly want us to be happy, blissfully chopping away amongst our friends and family while we're 100% under their control. And I'll add a sentence right here, verbally, I'll add a sentence that says they also want us to be clapping back at people who look like us, or clapping back at the people who are not them. They want us to be fighting people. They want us to be rallied up against those people. We want us to be fighting our own people, fighting people who are from different countries. They want us to be fighting things that are not going to threaten their power, because therefore we'll be so busy voicing our distrust about each other that we won't voice our distrust about the global capitalist system. Which I would urge anyone, if you're going to engage inside of these, maybe do it with equal time. If you want to badmouth someone and whatever, maybe spend at least some of that time doing it to your oppressor, if you want to at least argue that what you're doing is going to further you inside of this liberation struggle. Now, I'm going to scroll down some and just really quick hit on something that I think many people might not have heard about yet. It was reported in 2020 that Facebook has been working on an underwater cable that would engulf Africa in an effort to provide nearly 3 times the total network capacity of all subsea cables serving Africa today. And at the same time, Google, We discussed this. Logging into the CIA, that's what we do every time we log into Google, is also building an underwater cable to connect Africa with Europe. All of this is happening in real time, meaning a future is being determined for Africans to be locked into digital plantations, where we're forced to participate in a controlled digital system while our data is harvested by technological oligarchy designed to consolidate whatever power is left for the global elite. And just for a visual, this is actually a visual of the underwater cable that Facebook is building as we speak around Africa. And as we said, Google is doing something similar. Now, it's important to understand the whole premise of this article, data colonialism, is that they're getting a great return. Even if they weren't to make a buck off of this, they're getting a great return because they're getting control and surveillance. They understand that they're able to harvest your data. They're able to predict what you'll do. They're able to know where you are at all times. They're able to know what you're talking about, know who you distrust, know who you do trust. This is a powerful, powerful tool that far surpasses anything COINTELPRO was. And yet we're so just willing to give up our information. We're so willing to go to these Twitter groups, go to these different conversations with absolutely no second thought about the fact that we're literally logging into the national security of our oppressors to disclose our angst against other oppressed people. And regardless of where you fall on the debate, regardless of if you're like, I hate Africans, or you're like, I hate African Americans, wherever you are, I'm sure if you have a lick of information about what those people are facing, you should know that we're all being oppressed. You should know that we're all being oppressed by Europeans. What does this mean? That we all have a common oppressor. That's common sense. Just a plea with the people who are so quick to trust these multimedia, different types of platforms. We should just think it through. That is my plea to you, whoever you are. Even if you're comfortable putting all your information out there, putting out the fact that you don't like this, that, and the third about African Americans, regardless of where you fall, you're having this conversation in the wrong place. I think we can all agree on that. I think we could all agree that, hey, there could be a real potential to have a real conversation like this inside of a is somewhere that anyone can chime in. They could create a picture to make themselves look like you and say that, yeah, and they can, basically don't have to talk. You don't even have to hear what they sound like. And they can say, yeah, I'm African American. I hate Africans. And that's the person you're going to respond to. And meanwhile, guess who's going again unchecked about what they're doing to Africans in America and the diaspora at the same time? The white supremacist system, the colonial system, they remain unchecked. The Jim Crow mass incarceration system remains unchecked. The globalist colonial system inside of the United Nations and the WTO and the World Bank remains unchecked because you're too busy to have too much attention on one another and not enough on the one who's actually causing your real despair. So these are just some thoughts. I welcome yours. Love to hear your comments, particularly as we're entering into a new age where the digital is going to start meshing more and more with our physical. We're going to start seeing these two things become one to where they're indistinguishable. And yet we're going to, unfortunately, have people who are still not going to take this warning seriously. But hopefully those of us who do take it seriously are willing to find alternative ways to have conversations about differences amongst people in the diaspora, have real conversations about Black women and Black men, whatever you want to have conversations about outside of the gaze of our oppressor. So hopefully many of us will take heed and try to find ways outside of these mediums instead of just handing over our information and our prejudices and our disgust and everything to the people who have the most sentiment to keep it inside of a cloud that they're going to use to access information and predict your behavior at later dates. So with that, everyone, thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.